Ross, the Marikana massacre in 2012 forever altered South Africa's mining industry, particularly in how labor unions and mining companies relate to each other. How would you describe the labor landscape since then?
So it's been a year, and in many respects, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So what's changed, obviously, is that we've got about 80,000 members of the National Union of Mine Workers having deserted to AMCU, Association for Mine Workers and Construction Union. That's an educated guess. The stats are not that clear. But that changes the distribution of power as far as the labour landscape is concerned. So NUM, certainly prior to 2012, had been the monopoly union. AMCU enters the scene now, forever changing the nature of labour relations in the mining sector. Given that NUM and their association to the Tripartite Alliance has now started to diminish in influence. Where things have remained the same are the institutional arrangements. Despite recent amendments to labour legislation, we've still got three seriously problematic things, two of which pertain to legislation. One is that the closed shop system for entering bargaining councils hasn't really changed. The amendments to the new legislation are frankly a little bit confusing, but this is still a major problem recognised by Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe and so on, but not actually dealt with. And what it does is it creates this high-powered incentive for unions to become the officially recognised union on any given mine, both in terms of power and wealth, because members, non-union, non-officially recognised union members still pay a pro rata fee to the officially recognised union. And companies and the majority union get to set the threshold entry level by which unions can enter these bargaining council forums. And of course they have a massive incentive to set that threshold very high because it means lower transaction costs for them. They don't have to deal with as many unions. And that makes wage negotiations relatively more simple. The problem with the system now, it has been highlighted by the fact that there is competition for becoming the officially recognised union. While NUM was the monopoly, no problem. But with AMCU gaining ground, AMCU needs to appear credible to their members, and NUM are trying to win back members, which means that both of them make ridiculous wage demands. We want 100% wage demand increases for entry-level workers, then AMCU, not to be outdone, says we'll take 150%. And even though both unions and mining companies have an interest in sorting out this conflict, otherwise we'll see the destruction of the industry, it's as though both of their hands are tied. Mining companies simply can't pay that kind of wage increase. And unions, it seems, are more committed to gaining ground than they are to seeing the resolution of this problem. And then finally, migrant labour remains a mess. One of the things we're looking at the moment is the relationship between migrant labour and insecure communal tenure, especially from the labour sending areas, which are former homelands. You have this institutional persistence. So a lot of people are saying, hey, we have to sort out migrant labour, but nobody's actually offering any seriously credible policy solutions as to how we actually do that. So we need to look at that. We need to understand the relationship between the political and economic institutions here, and there's a lot of legislative change that's needed in order to change the way these incentive structures are working.
The South African government will not entertain any talk of nationalisation, and they're desperate to allay investor fears, especially in terms of labour unrest. Are they doing enough to support the industry?
So the short answer to the question is no. No, government are not doing enough. And in fact, while they have been, members of cabinet have been at pains to allay investor fears regarding nationalisation and so on. What isn't often stated or recognised is that there are various forms of nationalisation that already exist. Embedded in the 2004 Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act is this notion, in fact, that the state has become the custodian of the resources, which was a complete reversal to the 1991 Act, which said that mineral resources are privately owned. Whoever has the surface rights owns the minerals beneath the soil. But the 2004 Act, in line with the 1955 Freedom Charter, said no, that's reversed. But the whole concept of state custodianship is very difficult, and it's created an enormous number of problems. But as far as the industry itself is concerned and what government is doing to support it, they're just not doing enough because they haven't credibly committed to reversing the ambiguities, the definitional ambiguities and uncertainty surrounding legislations.
Amendments to the current minerals legislation is currently before Parliament and has generated some controversy. What are the points of contention and the implications thereof for the future?
So just to frame the context for these amendments, you've got a mining industry that over the longest sustained commodity boom in recent history contracted at a rate of 1% per annum, while its top 20 competitors grew at a rate of roughly 5% per annum. So the major opportunity that South Africa had to leverage its $2.5 trillion worth of mineral resources left untapped. We haven't tapped into that potential. And that's attributable to a number of factors, but like I said, predominantly attributable to uncertainty surrounding legislation. So in 2010, Mining Minister Susan Shabangu says, all right, we recognize that there are these ambiguities around the conversion of old to new order mining rights. We recognize that it's created some problems. There are areas of extensive ministerial discretion. We can't have that, so we need to change it. Legislation was promised to arrive around the end of 2011, eventually only arrived at the end of 2012 and is now sitting before Parliament. 4 major points of contention. Contextualizing all of that is the minister hadn't in fact done anything to ensure that ministerial discretion was reduced. If anything, it's been extended. Within that preface, then there are 4 major issues. One, there's no clarity now at all over how prospecting and mining rights will be allocated. This is probably the most important micro-institution that you could possibly think of when it comes to operating mining rights jurisdiction. Previously, the regime operated on a first in, first assessed principle, which is simple, it's clear, it's not administratively burdensome. There's speculation around using an auction bid system. We're doing some work on that, just trying to provide government with some input as to what the best approach may be. Second major issue is that of beneficiation, which relates in part to the nationalisation question you asked earlier. And government is convinced that beneficiation is necessary, and so you could call beneficiation a form of resource nationalism, though that term isn't particularly helpful. The amendments to the legislation, so that the minister has the discretion by which to decide which minerals are strategic, in inverted commas, and what percentage of minerals may be exported and which percentage have to remain behind for local beneficiation purposes. The fact that no clarity is provided in the legislation as to exactly what percentage that will be, or exactly which minerals are to be declared strategic, raises huge concerns for the industry because it means it's very difficult to plan. It's almost impossible to invest under those conditions because mining projects have long lead times, and we're looking at 20 years often before a mining project comes to fruition. And if after 20 years you don't know how much of your product is actually still going to belong to you and be available for making a profit, you're not likely to invest. And then 2 other perhaps slightly smaller issues are that there's there's now a requirement that if you want to transfer your licenses between companies, you have to ask the minister for permission, which of course puts huge administrative burden, high transaction costs. And then there's also a peculiar claim that if minerals are concentrated in the hands of one particular company, the Department of Mineral Resources would have the discretion to intervene and to declare that non-competitive. The major point of contention there is, well, that's the job for the Competition Commission. This is not, it doesn't fall under the ambit of the Department of Mineral Resources. And so really we should abandon that. Legislation needs to be clear, it needs to be simple.
How do you expect this to be resolved?
It's not clear that they will be easily resolved, so I think that's an important point to make. But more than anything else, they will be subject to parliamentary process, which itself is now in a difficult position given that we've got elections coming up in 2014. So it looks as though this process won't be finalised before April 2014. That in itself is both a blessing and a curse, quite literally, because if it were to go through in its current form, we would quite honestly have mining legislation in the realm of the DRC. We don't want to go there. However, for the uncertainty to endure and for the process to be subject to political dynamics is also not ideal. So best case scenario would be we sort out these major points of contention, pass the legislation and have it done before the end of November. And it's important that these issues get resolved not just for their own sake, but actually because socioeconomic stability depends on it. We've got a 10-to-1 dependency ratio on each mining job in South Africa. So if you consider 3,300 workers going on strike and potentially losing their jobs, that's 33,000 people now out of an income and having to be reliant on the state. So the state has every interest in resolving these issues, and certainly not just for itself, but because this actually matters for real people's lives. This matters for the poor, it matters for the poorest of the poor in the working class. It also means then that potential job creation isn't stifled. That's really what we want to see.
Russ, thank you for talking to us.